Once you start formatting some text on the page, you'll probably start looking around for fonts. Now, how do I change the font of my text? Let me start by just removing some of this text just to clean this page up a little bit before we go on. I'll just kind of take that out of there so we have a little less text to play with on the screen at once. But if I wanted to format this blah, 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 I can't find any fonts here. And if you're used to working with Dreamweaver CS3 or previous versions, you may really be confused because they used to be in the Property Inspector. But fonts are now in a new section of the Property Inspector, the CSS Property Inspector. So if you click on this CSS option, you'll see a whole nother collection of formatting options because Dreamweaver is now requiring that when you use certain formatting options, you create a style at the same time. And it's really not just Adobe that's now requiring that you use CSS for formatting. It's really Adobe trying to follow the rules of the W3C and to stick to web standards. There are more and more HTML options that are being deprecated, or more simply stated, simply no longer recommended on the web, and therefore probably not going to be supported forever on the web. One of those options is the center tag. Some of the others have to do with attributes that affect how fonts are applied. So in order to change the font of any of the text on this or other pages in Dreamweaver, you're going to have to create a CSS style. The simplest way to do that is to just select the text so you can format it, switch to the CSS option here in the Properties Inspector, and then go over to your font option. So if I want to make this Verdana, instead of the default Times that's displayed in most browsers, I can choose Verdana, and notice now that the new CSS rule dialog automatically opens. Now we will spend a lot more time with this dialog in a future chapter, and I will explain to you in detail why you might choose one selector type over another. But for the moment, as you're just trying to get the basics of Dreamweaver, just accept whatever Dreamweaver recommends when you choose that formatting option. So Dreamweaver is recommending a class selector. I'm going to go for it. If I've got a selector name with a blank field, I'm going to add a name. Let's call this Fancy Text. Again, remember, no spaces or special characters, although you can generally use dashes and underscores when you're naming styles. And I'm going to leave this to this document only, meaning this will be created as a rule applicable only to this file, not in an external style sheet, and click OK. So just using all the defaults that Dreamweaver gave us, notice now that the font's automatically been applied to the text, and down here that there's now a new targeted rule that's been created. And notice too that Fancy Text, which is what I named this style or this rule, has a dot at the beginning of it. And again, we'll look much more at this later, but all class styles begin with a dot. And if you don't include that dot in the dialog, as I neglected to do just now, Dreamweaver will automatically insert that dot for you. In the CSS chapters, I'll be very careful about naming these, but just so you can see, Dreamweaver is watching your back. And even if you name something a little improperly in a CSS style, Dreamweaver will try to fix it for you. Now you may also be wondering why, when I wanted to make this Verdana, I had to choose Verdana, Geneva, and Sans Serif. If you're new to working with fonts on the web, let me just give you a quick overview here. Dreamweaver has created what we call font sets, and it has to do with the fact that when you use a different font from the default in your web pages, that font has to be on the computer of the person viewing your web page for it to display in that font. Now, because there's no guarantee that everyone with a computer on the planet has every font you might have on your hard drive, Dreamweaver's created collections of the most common fonts. And it's created these collections because it knows that most web browsers will display the first font on the list if it's available. In this case, it would be Georgia. So what happens when you apply a font collection like I did to this text, Verdana, Geneva, Sans Serif, is that a web browser displaying this page will look on the hard drive of the visitor to find the Verdana font. If that font is not available on the user's computer, then the browser will look for the next font on the list. In this case, Geneva is listed, again because it's a very common font and it's one that looks quite similar to Verdana. So if your user doesn't have Verdana but does have Geneva, then the text will display in Geneva. If your user doesn't have either of those fonts, Then what this font set is saying is use whatever sans serif font is available. So browser, try Verdana, if not, try Geneva, if not, get me a sans serif font. That's essentially what this font collection says. Similarly, the font collection Georgia, comma, New Times Roman, comma, Times, comma, serif. Now there you've got 4 options. Use Georgia if it's available, if not, use Times New Roman, if not, at least try and find Times, and if all else fails, I want a serif font. If you're not familiar with the basics of fonts, serifs are those little curly edges you see on fonts like Times, and sans serif are the more clean, straight fonts, like this text here, formatted in Verdana. If you want, you can actually edit this font list and create your own font collections. And again, I recommend that you use very common fonts, at least as backups. But if you want, you can create sets that have somewhat less common fonts as the first option, as long as you create sets that have other fonts. As long as you create more common alternatives, your designs should look pretty close to how you intended them. This dialog works pretty simply. You've got all of the fonts available on your computer, available here on a list. You create a new font list by using the plus sign, so now add fonts below this list. You choose the ones that you want by moving the arrow over, and you can add multiple fonts in that way. I'm going to cancel for now to keep just the collection of fonts that comes with Dreamweaver in my version of the program, so that's all that will be available as I go through the rest of this series.